Hello, class. Professor Mandeville back. This is lecture number 21 for History 102. We finished up last lecture talking about Teapot Dome. So we want to pick up with more corruption in the Harding administration. Now, I'll remind you, the 1920s is that period of prohibition like we talked about last lecture. And one thing that was very valuable during prohibition was a federal liquor permit. People could get a permit issued to them by the federal government that allowed them to purchase and consume alcoholic beverages for supposedly medicinal purposes. But these were not very common, and in fact, they had to be signed by the Attorney General himself, who was a man by the name of Doherty in the Harding administration. So these are highly sought after permits, which basically gave you carte blanche to drink if you wanted to during Prohibition. So what happened was, it turns out that the Attorney General of the United States was selling these permits out of his office in Washington, D.C. So they're sort of going to the highest bidder. This had always been sort of a rumor that spread around Washington. Ultimately, they ran a sting operation on him, caught him red-handed. And what's going to happen here is Congress will bring him up on impeachment charges. Because remember, you can impeach cabinet officials also. And before they end up having a trial in the Senate, Doherty will reach sort of a plea bargain agreement where he will resign from office in disgrace and the impeachment proceedings will end. Legal ramifications against him are never pursued, but it'll be a big embarrassment for both him, part of the Ohio gang, and President Harding. So Harding, in the summer of 1923, is going to go on a nationwide speaking tour trying to save face with all this corruption that's being associated with this administration. Because the very next year, obviously, 1924, is an election year, and he has, he's thinking of down the road, so to speak. Now, while on this speaking tour in the city of San Francisco, Harding will come down with a case of pneumonia. He'll be hospitalized for that. Complications with this pneumonia, including thrombosis, will set in, and President Harding will pass away on August 2nd, 1923. So that means his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, from the state of Vermont, will become president of the United States in August of 23. Now, Calvin Coolidge, commonly known as Silent Cal. Calvin Coolidge was a very conservative champion of big business. And if you look on page 727 in your book, there's a famous photograph of Calvin Coolidge at his home and property in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, trout fishing in one of his ponds in a three-piece suit with knee boots on. Only Silent Cal would go fishing in a three-piece suit. Now, his home in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, which is down in southern Vermont, down in the Killington area, is both a state and federal historic site today. It's part state of Vermont site, part national park. It's a very interesting place. They preserved the little village that was next to it, and it's quite nice place to visit. And in fact, you can see that exact pond, and you can see the spot where Coolidge was standing if you ever visit there. I've been there several times, taking groups there. It's especially a nice place to go to in the fall when the colors are out. Now, to give you an idea of how committed he was to big business, Calvin Coolidge used to hang out with big businessmen. He was a very close friend of Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Harry Firestone, and others. And they used to vacation together. Now, if you look on page 727 in your book, there's a little part here I'm going to read you that really shows you how committed he was to big business in America. And in the paragraph, first full one underneath this photograph there, in the middle of it, it says, quote, or your authors write, true to Republican philosophy, he, meaning Coolidge, became the, quote, high priest of the great God business. He, Coolidge, believed that, quote, the man who builds a factory builds a temple, and the man who works there worships there. Now, I don't know if any of you have worked in a factory before. I worked in a few factories before I went to college, and in the summers when I was going to college. I never thought I was going to church when I went to work at a factory. I never looked at it as a temple I worshiped at. And if you know anybody who works in a factory, or if you ever have, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But to a guy like Coolidge, who only hangs out with the people that own the factories, that's the way he saw it. So, Silent Cal from Vermont, our only president from Vermont, is in office. And during this time period, there's in the mid-20s already hints that doom is in the future start appearing as far as the Great Depression coming. But we'll be talking about that in a little bit. So pretty quickly, the election of 1924 rolls around. And Calvin Coolidge is going to run on his own as the now sitting president. He'll be the Republican nominee. The Democrats will end up nominating a conservative Wall Street businessman and friend of J.P. Morgan, John Davis, as their candidate. This act by the Democrats will split the party in two. And a lot of the party will shift and become supporters of the Progressive Party, which still exists, but it's in its waning days. This is like the last gasp of the progressives. And they're going to nominate our old pal, Fighting Bob La Follette from Wisconsin, as their progressive candidate for the presidency in 1924. So this will be a three-person race, and Coolidge will win it easily because of the divided Democrat vote. Coolidge will garner nearly 16 million votes, and if you take a look on page 729, you can see the results of that election. Davis, the Democrat, will come in second with 8.3. Fighting Bob will receive nearly 5 million votes, which is pretty respectable showing for a third-party candidate. But it won't translate to many electoral college votes. So, Coolidge is reelected as president. And the next thing we want to talk about is right there on that page, same page in your textbook, 729, and that's figure 35, which shows us what becomes known as the financial merry-go-round of the 1920s. Now, background information on this, there's really two factors here. We pointed out that one impact of World War I was the United States emerged as a creditor nation. When the war began, countries owed us money, or we owed other countries money. When the war ended, especially European countries owed us a tremendous amount of money to both the government and to Wall Street investors. The other big factor in this is the Treaty of Versailles, which allowed for England, France, and Italy to charge Germany war reparations, to punish them for the war. Now, for quite some time, the Europeans never tried to collect any of these war reparations. It's always kind of a threat that they hold over, over the Germans' heads. But technically speaking, they were owed $32 billion, according to the Treaty of Versailles. So, here's what happens. U.S. investors had loaned Italy, France, and England about $10 billion. The U.S. Treasury had loaned the Allies about the same amount. So these bills come due, and France, England, and Italy are still struggling from the effects of the war. And the United States wants its money. These countries enter into negotiations with the Coolidge Administration, trying to get them to at least forgive the $10 billion that these countries owed the United States Treasury. They argued it was a cost of war. We had to rebuild our countries. We lost, all these men. You didn't. So why don't you just write it off as a cost of World War I? Calvin Coolidge, the strict conservative, would have no part of that. And he basically said, a debt's a debt. You're going to pay it. So here's what happens. The European countries decide, the United States wants this money. I guess we better start collecting the war reparations from Germany. So they go to Germany with their hands out and say, you got to start paying us billions of dollars you owe us according to the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was in worse shape than they were. They were war-torn, lost a lot of people, had to rebuild their country. So they're scrambling for money. They go to Wall Street investors and get loans from them. They take that money lent to them, and as you can see on that chart on the bottom of page 729, they pay reparations to England and France. England and France turn around and pay the war debt to the United States Treasury. So, ironically enough, the money begins here in the United States in the hands of U.S. investors, is lent to Germany. Germany pays England and France, and they turn around and send it right back to the United States where it started from. That's why we call it a merry-go-round. It's silly. So, what this is going to end up doing? Completely ruining the German economy. Because France and England still have their hands out. They want to be paid these war reparations. Germany runs out of loan possibilities. So what they end up doing is just rolling the printing presses and printing money with nothing to back it up. And when you do that, it causes horrendous inflation. This is going to completely ruin the German economy. And in fact, inflation will run so rampant in Germany by the mid-20s that instead of printing new money, they're just stamping new denominations on paper money. So they'd take like a 1,000 mark note, because marks were the German currency at the time, and stamp on it 1 million mark. They didn't even want to go to the trouble of printing new. It was too expensive. And German workers, inflation was so bad, you'd get paid twice a day. You'd get paid at your lunch break, what you earned in the morning, so you could run out on your lunch break and buy things, because by the time 5 o'clock rolled around and you got out of work, the prices could skyrocket that much. So they'd pay you again that evening, and you'd go and buy what you could. It was a case where the poor average German needed a grocery cart to wheel all his money in and then come out with a little bag with maybe a loaf of bread in it. That's how bad it was. This ruins Germany. And what it ultimately does is it helps augment the Great Depression, but worse than that, it allows Adolf Hitler to rise to power, because he's going to blame all this on Jewish bankers in Germany who had nothing to do with it. He's going to use them as scapegoats, rise to power, and that's why we end up fighting World War II in the long run. So this is one horrible situation that no one realizes at the time, but those are the ultimate repercussions. So the next thing we want to talk about here is the next election that rolls around. We'll get that out of the way. That's the election of 1928. And we can see the results of that particular election on page 732. Now, in this election, Calvin Coolidge has had enough of being president, serving, a term and a half. So he goes into retirement to his Plymouth Notch home in Vermont, leaves us with a wide open election, and the Republicans, excuse me for a minute, will nominate Herbert Hoover as their candidate. The Democrats, who have reunited, will nominate the highly popular governor of the state of New York, Al Smith. Excuse me, I got a tickle in my throat. Now, Alfred Smith, or Al Smith as he's commonly known, is highly popular in New York, and part of the reason is he blatantly defies prohibition. He's not shy to be pictured with an alcoholic drink in his hand, and basically told the federal government he wasn't really going to enforce prohibition in New York State. If the feds wanted to come in and do it, let them. He's not spending state money on it. He thought prohibition was ridiculous and wanted no part of it, like a lot of Americans, especially New Yorkers. So, it's Hoover versus Smith, a two-person race. The Progressive Party now has just faded out of existence, and it's the last we'll hear from them. So, one prominent part of this campaign is it's the first time ever radios are used in political campaigning. Both candidates will run radio ads. Now, when the votes are all tallied up, Hoover will win, as you can see, by, excuse me, I need to drink water. Slightly more than 6 million votes. Now, here's what really cost Al Smith the election. Most historians and political pundits believe Al Smith would have been a fantastic president. He was a great politician, great leader in the largest state in the Union at the time, New York. And here's what cost Al Smith the election, besides his open defiance of prohibition, which gained him the nickname Alcohol Smith by his critics. Here's the other big factor, believe it or not. He is the first ever Roman Catholic to run for the presidency. And critics were saying that a vote for Al Smith was like a vote for the Pope. Now, you have to realize, back at the turn of the century in this country, there was a lot of prejudice, and it wasn't just aimed at African Americans. Jews were the victims of prejudice. We talked about, what a daring thing it was for Wilson to appoint Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court. Catholics were also the victims of prejudice, and especially Protestants had big problems voting for a Catholic president. So because of this, and the fact that he defied prohibition, he's going to lose this election. And, had those two things not been working against him, in all likelihood, he'd have won. But let's think about it for a second. We've only, in the history of this country, elected one Catholic president. That was John F. Kennedy. And in the election of 1960, believe it or not, there was grumblings behind the scene that a vote for Kennedy was like a vote for the Pope, too. And there was even this vicious rumor floating around that Kennedy had a secret hot phone line right to the Vatican from the Oval Office and was taking advice strictly from the Pope. What a bunch of nonsense. I don't know if you've ever studied the Cuban Missile Crisis, but there certainly was no chatting with the Pope as to what to do about the Cuban missile site bases the Russians were constructing when we were on the verge of World War III. It's all a bunch of prejudice nonsense that unfortunately still exists in this country, aiming at different groups. So, that's where we're going to call her quits for today. When I pick up again later on this week and talk to you, we'll talk about the things that led right to the Great Depression, the crash of the stock market, and then the ushering in of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. So, I've ran out of voice today. So I hope everybody's healthy, be safe, stay home, and we'll get through this. Take care now.